you do care about getting food from a restaurant that is nearby, because you cannot get, if I live in London, I cannot get food from a restaurant in New York. I really care about their London restaurant.
He knows something that I am currently unaware of.
Yes, there were hundreds of them, which was very surprising to us. In a lot of smaller towns across the US, there are these like locally owned and operated food delivery systems that have been running for years.
The restaurants don't like working with these third parties. They charge outrageous fees. The drivers sometimes steal the food.
Some cities in the US, like Chicago and others, have forced companies to release data where they have like the specifics of the ride and then the amount of money that they charge and how much they gave to the driver.
I'll get an exclusive range of restaurants. I'll find some hidden gems. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon for those of you who have joined us from wherever you are. It's very early in the morning for Andres and Mike, our guests on the show today. Thank you for joining. And it's late in the evening here in India. And so we have a wide spectrum of folks here in the call today. And I'm Sindhuja. I'm a Beckn Open Collective volunteer and head Global North programs at FIDE. And I'm your host for today's episode of Beckn Beyond. Beckn Beyond, as most of you know, is where we have explorers of Beckn join us for a conversation on their experiences and their journey with open networks and with Beckn in their respective domains, which could be across commerce, mobility, healthcare, law and justice, education, skilling, energy, climate action and sustainability, and probably countless others that I'm probably missing out. And today it's on food delivery. So how do we enable food delivery, inclusion, choice, access in the space of food delivery with an open network approach? And how have Andres and Mike, explored this in their initiative? So that's what today's talk is about. And it is my pleasure to welcome them to the talks today. Andres is a lab director and professor at the Princeton University. And I'll hand it over to Andres for a full formal, proper introduction, Andres, of your background and what you do at the HCI lab and the work that is done there as well, because that will give us a really nice context.
Thank you. My name is Andres. I'm a professor here at Princeton, and I lead a human-computer interaction lab. So one of the areas that we focus on is on the future of work and how technology enables new forms of opportunities for people to earn money, but also new challenges. I joined Princeton about 3 years ago, a little bit less than 3 years ago, after spending a decade in different tech companies, including Microsoft and Snapchat. And when I joined Princeton, I started to focus more on public interest technology, and so thinking less about how do we make more profit for a large tech company and more about how do we empower smaller businesses and small communities. And so that's kind of what led us to focus on this area, the future of work, and we are doing work both on studying and building new technologies.
Thank you, Andres. Mike is co-founder of Nosh Delivery, which is a platform for restaurants, but owned by restaurants, if I got that right, Mike. And I'll hand it over to Mike for an introduction of himself and Nosh as well. What is Nosh? What's its business model and all of that? Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. So Nosh, my co-founder and I have a combined decade of experience building different local food delivery networks of different shapes and sizes and varieties across some markets in the US. And our fundamental learning is that a lot of restaurants and a lot of drivers have a very suboptimal relationship with the big third-party food delivery marketplaces, in that they provide very little opportunity for growth. They are traditionally rent-seeking platforms, meaning that the value that they provide to the stakeholders that use the platforms is less than the value they provide. So they extract a lot of value and have this sort of asymmetrical relationship with the stakeholders. And after many years of trying to build competitive services, we decided that one great way to build a competitive service is to have a cooperative business model where the restaurants could come together and collectively own a competitive service. So a lot of restaurants in the US have been doing profitable food delivery for a while. And after these third-party delivery giants come in and work in these local networks, they extract a tremendous amount of value, and these restaurants suffer in the form of significant losses. And so we launched a competitive cooperative food delivery service in Colorado a handful of years ago, which has been very successful. And yeah, that's background on Nosh.
That's a very interesting model, cooperative in food delivery. I mean, cooperatives, we know the benefits of it in various sectors. In food delivery is something that is new and interesting. So, and like you said, Mike, I think just going by statistics, food delivery is a huge business. In the US alone, it's around, I don't know, depending on which source you look at, it's around $350 billion just in 2024, growing steadily, highly competitive, and probably dominated by 2 or 3 large gig work model kind of players, which is, there are DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, few more like that. India has its own Zomato and Swiggy, who are pretty much in the same league. Uber Eats was there for a while, and now they've taken over. So I think Uber Eats is the number 1 operator across in the space. So they have a model that is probably works for the large chains of restaurants, established players who can afford the kind of model they have in terms of commissions, and also not being able to put forth their terms and conditions, their own terms and conditions, basically having lesser autonomy. And where the smaller restaurants or the unique restaurants, not a chain, but a local eatery that's serving the local community, is well liked, but will not be able to afford, firstly, the larger gig work kind of platforms and have a wider access and reach, they kind of lose out. So the alternative model, and not just in terms of cost, but also the loss of autonomy. So which is why the model that you are exploring is extremely interesting, Andres and Mike. And I would like to go a little bit more into this. Andres, maybe you can talk about how did this whole exploration of this space, how did the idea first come? Why did you start studying this sector, the independent restaurants, as well as having independent smaller platforms versus the gig platforms? If you could talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually, the reason I started working in this space is when I was at Microsoft, one of the things that we did a lot was to rely on on-demand labor for providing services that otherwise were about to be automated. So to give you an example, we were building a scheduling assistant, kind of like ChatGPT that you can CC on an email. This is like 15 years ago. And it will take over the scheduling of a meeting and so on. And behind the scenes, we had some automatic processes and some humans doing some of the micro tasks that were part of the process that were not automated yet. And then we will collect the data and then kind of automate the things over time. But as we were using a lot of these platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk and others that were like on-demand labor platforms, we started to realize that we were kind of creating a new class of labor that was often exploited, paid very little, often kind of below the APIs, meaning that, we will not interact with them. We will just submit requests and magically they will appear. And so that was kind of both sad and kind of surprising. And then at the same time, there were new services that were doing the same thing, but for the offline world, for the physical world. So at the time, Uber had just started, and everybody was like enamored with Uber, like, oh, it's so cool. You push a button, a magic happens, somebody comes and pick you up. Similar to what we were doing with Mechanical Turk workers and stuff like that. And so then I started to realize that this will be a nice opportunity to think about kind of removing that middle layer of kind of the marketplace that Uber was providing and kind of thinking about alternatives that will give back the power to the people who were doing the labor. And so back then, when I was at Microsoft, we actually created, we worked with an organization that in Seattle did domestic work, like people who clean houses and stuff like that. And we tried to
Right.
create a Uber for domestic workers because they had typically just you had to make a phone call and somebody will answer
Right.
and then will send somebody to your house. And we thought, well, the gigification of the economy is gonna spread beyond transportation. It will go to any domain, which is happening
Right.
already. And we tried to convince like unions and other organizations to like join, but at the time I felt like everybody was too enamored, too happy with kind of the Ubers of the world, and they were oh they're
Yeah.
disrupting like evil
No, I
centralized
think
powers of the taxis.
true.
Yeah,
No, I was just saying the pros and cons. I think any sector which was very unorganized,
mhm,
it was a way to kind of organize through aggregation.
exactly.
But but the cons, like you said,
Yeah.
tending towards looking at them as commodities, or since they are not visible, literally not visible,
Mhm,
kind of human
mhm,
automatons, right? And
exactly.
treated as such. Sorry,
Yeah, yeah.
I
As a
interrupted you.
user,
Yeah.
yeah, as a user or customer, it's amazing. Like much better of experience than what we used to have, like, call a taxi and wait or whatever. Like, so it was definitely a better experience for the consumer, but it was never thinking about the full fast forward 10 years later. Once I started here at Princeton, I kind of wanted to revisit those ideas because I realized that nothing in that space had happened. And so I started talking around with people about like these sort of ideas, and it seemed to me that the transportation part was extremely politicized, and it was very hard to work on that space, partly because a lot of the people who are kind of the workers are very busy. They have like five different jobs, and they just don't have
Right.
as much time for experimentation. And then somebody mentioned, actually, a colleague that knows Mike and his co-founder mentioned,
Mhm.
hey, why don't you think about this space in the food delivery scenarios? Because there is already some interest by the restaurants, and the restaurants do have some bandwidth and space to think about this. Some of them have some amount of money. I mean, obviously not a ton, but like more than the
Yeah.
drivers would. And this is an interesting space to look at. And then they connected me to Nosh because they were already doing a cooperative alternative to this. And so kind of when we started to talk about these ideas, the motivation was to better understand what are the current needs of platforms like Nosh, and then
Mhm.
thinking about what are the potential opportunities to build new technologies that may address some of those shortcomings. And so that's kind of what got us started in this particular space, thinking about the decentralization of power from like one single entity like Uber or, Didi, like for example, from China, that have try to solve the problem for everyone, and instead thinking about the decentralized approach that the internet started with. Like everybody used to run their own web server or their own email server and things like that. So
Absolutely.
how do we think about that decentralization? So that's kind of what led us to this space of food delivery as a way to build and understand what are the kinds of needs that people may have in these communities.
I think you encapsulated it really well when you said it's like the internet, how it's completely decentralized, open, everybody's able to access it. There is no friction, right? Anybody can access it from anywhere, and it's open to all. And but however, everything that is built on the internet is not, whether it is the ride hailing industry or the food delivery industry or stay accommodation. So and that's exactly what an open decentralized approach is trying to address, which is, can we go back to thinking about how the internet itself was inherently designed to be open. So Mike, is that how you became part of this exploration with Andres? If you could talk to us a little bit about how did your initial collaboration with a research project originate, or was it even before that? How did this whole, given the area you're in, building a cooperative model for food delivery, was it more from a business side, technology side? If you could throw some light on how this whole
Yeah.
journey for you began.
Yeah, so Nosh has been, we've had a very isolated impact on a very small, like a regional impact on a small group of restaurants. And we've been thinking for a long time, how do you scale locally
Right.
owned, user-owned networks? And it's very challenging to do that because, and the interesting thing about food delivery is that the network effects are highly geographically constrained, hyper-local network
Exactly.
effects.
Yeah.
And the history of food delivery is actually very interesting because it's sort of the story of lower middle market acquisitions of smaller delivery companies, where the big players with a tremendous amount of capital purchased a bunch of smaller players, and actually like significantly increased the commissions they were paying to the restaurants. And as a result of this remote party trying to run a local service, there's a huge degradation in the quality of the service. And even today, a lot of the third-party marketplaces have serious problems because they treat the drivers as this disposable commodity resource. And as a result, the drivers treat the service that they perform as a disposable job. And so the quality of service is very low because you have this remote third party trying to impose a one-size-fits-all solution to a very local operation. And so the problem, though, is that not each of these local markets can justify the expenses required to build a full stack of infrastructure to run a local service. So this idea that Andres and the lab at Princeton University were working on was this idea of a federation of shared infrastructure network where everybody didn't have to rebuild the same suite of technologies just to run their own local market, but there could be open source software that performed niche roles within this broader, more complex last mile delivery network. And you could have different people building different pieces of that software, all speaking the same language and interoperating. So the Nosh applications could work with the local food delivery cooperative in Boston or in Princeton, New Jersey. And that idea of a shared infrastructure layer where you could open a network to a broader participation of developers and local businesses, to me, struck me as a very revolutionary idea, maybe one of the biggest ideas in this next evolution of network-based products. We're going to be more decentralized, open, and owned by the users. And we started our exploration because the HDI lab was doing research on decentralized social media, federated decentralized social media protocols. And we thought that this was a very obvious idea. That idea of a federation worked very well with this idea of a federation of geographically isolated servers that represented the individuals in those markets. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said the idea was obvious, because it's typically obvious in retrospect. We've seen that, in our conversations with industry or academia or anybody across these sectors, that the typical tendency is having a platform, solving whatever is the problem area using a platform-based approach. And it is not intuitive for them to think about it, like you said, Mike, as a federated, open, decentralized network model kind of approach. Look at it as something that can be not everything on one platform like it is in Uber, for example. Me as a rider has to use Uber to order an Uber vehicle or Uber driver. I cannot be on a different platform and order for services or products on a different platform. That thought process is not intuitive, and bringing about that kind of shift in thinking is probably the first big step. And you saying that that seemed like a very obvious and idea that made a lot of sense, because not only does it help the businesses, it also helps you have developer communities participate in the building of the platforms and the technology infrastructure, because all of it is open. So great points there. Just taking this further. So I think the project had established that we would be using open technologies and an open network kind of approach to see how can we look at the food delivery model a little differently, both from a business side as well as how the technology stacks up. What was your first brush with Beckn itself? I mean, there is a whole host of open technologies out there. So Andres, how did you come across Beckn protocol in your explorations?
Yeah, so maybe I can give you a little bit of background. So when we started to explore this space of kind of food delivery and talking to Mike and Glitson, his co-founder, there were a few things that we started to learn. One is that there were companies that were successfully running like Nosh for many years. They've been very successful in smaller towns in the US. And so we started by doing some research in understanding kind of how Nosh works and what are the challenges that it has. And then from
Right.
there, we started to wonder, like, are there other places and other companies like Nosh that are, at least in the US, running and operating? And we learned that, yes, there were hundreds of them, which was very surprising to us because,
Right.
most of us are familiar with the big ones. And we started to realize that in a lot of smaller towns across the US, there are these like locally owned and operated food delivery systems that have been running for years. And so then we were very curious about that. And so we did a survey and some interviews with people who have been running these systems. We learned that they even like get together every year. They have like a conference, an organization, and so it was very well kind of organized from a business perspective. Then when we started to learn more about the technologies that they use, they all seem very frustrated with the technologies they use. So when we talked to Mike's co-founder Glitson, you know, and they were all like, oh, the user experience sucks. It's like, from the 1990s. The experience for the dispatcher and the drivers also is not great. Not only that, but the technology is expensive, and is kind of it's built by some third-party companies, and then they charge you a rent basically and transaction fees and so
Mhm.
on. So both was like not great as a user experience and expensive. And despite all of that, these companies were, running and operating. So that was very impressive. And so it felt like a good opportunity to think about like building something that could be shared across all these communities. And then the other piece that we started to do is like mock up kind of the user experience of what a decentralized alternative may look like. We started to do that in collaboration with Nosh. And then we realized that there are like essentially three stakeholders in this business. There is obviously the restaurants, who have their own like point of sale and all this infrastructure. There are the drivers, like the couriers, which may be driving a car, maybe driving a bicycle or a
Right.
motorcycle.
Yeah.
And then there is the customers, and each of them needs very different things. And so we kind of split the work into like we will focus primarily on the couriers, and then
Right.
Nosh has been building very effectively the other part, and they even raise funding to do some of that. So that's kind of what we started to do. And then where Beckn came in, I forgot exactly who mentioned it. I remember there were two scenarios. One, I have a grad student who works in my lab who is from India and who knew about Namayatri and all these things. And then he's like,
Okay.
oh, I think they're using some technology. And so then we started to learn more about it and be excited about the fact that there is already a standard language for describing a lot of the things that we were thinking about. I believe
Mm-hmm.
also, Mike, maybe you found something online and maybe you mentioned it to us. But anyway, so we started to get awareness of what other people have done because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Obviously, if something already is successful in other places, especially if it's free and open source, we could learn a lot from it. In fact, we did find an organization in Europe called Cycle Co-op. And Cycle Co-op is like an open source software for food
Yeah.
delivery. But
Right.
one of the challenges for us, but it's great for them, is that their license constrains you to only use it in businesses that rely 100% on bicycle delivery. It's great for the
Yeah.
environment, but it doesn't work in many places. At least in the US, it's such a car-centric, country. People drive everywhere. Distances are very far. So yeah, it may work great in Europe, but not anywhere else. And so, they develop the software, so they have the right to set up whatever license they want to have, but their license requires you to use bicycles. And so also we tried the software, and it was not kind of what you will expect necessarily from like the traditional food delivery systems from like a user experience. So anyway, so we found a
Right.
number of things, but when we found about Beckn, it seemed like it was a very general purpose protocol that didn't constrain you to a specific kind of domain, like food delivery, for
Mm-hmm.
example.
Yeah.
And so it's very, very easy to think about ways of repurposing that. And then, we learned there's a broader community, so that all was kind of exciting to think about, not being isolated in the development process. And so that's kind of how we landed into Beckn.
I think, Andres, for us, it's very heartening to hear, how you came across Beckn and, how you instantly recognize that it is very abstract and can lend itself. I mentioned a whole number of sectors at the start of this conversation. It is not restricted to food delivery or ride hailing or healthcare. I mean, it's across sectors, and uh, being able to do the same actions of looking for something online, which is typically whether it's something buying on a website, or looking for a ride, or booking a stay, booking a diagnostic service, looking for a lawyer. It could be any sector, but it's typically you're looking for something, or trying to discover something, and you're ordering and you're adding to cart, so to speak, or completing your ride, which is the equivalent. This is what Beckn does. So discover, order, fulfill, and then the post fulfillment. And literally every single sector can be abstracted to this, and that is precisely, I mean, that's how it has been designed, and which is why there are no constraints. And for us, it's especially heartening because typically as community volunteers, we are trying to explain firstly the concept of, let's not stick to a platform-based approach, look at a protocol-based approach, do a shift in thinking, move towards open network model, which has all of these benefits, reduces the cost for all the players on the network, all of that. And I think maybe Dr. Pramod visited the campus, Princeton University. I think he probably also stumbled across the project and was delighted, so to speak. So just how, for us, and this is literally how the internet also is, right? There are things happening everywhere, and then it's not necessary that there is a central view of who all are using, which is our dream here, in the way we are trying to make Beckn the protocol for any economic transaction in the world.
Yeah.
So
Actually, another thing that I found exciting about Beckn in general is, so I'm originally from Mexico, and at least in developing countries, we tend to always like get technology from elsewhere, and so everything is like built elsewhere for some other economic conditions. And I was inspired by the fact that something from India had been developed and successfully been deployed in India and in other places. And so I thought it was like a nice way of thinking about innovation, not always being based in developed countries, and so you're really thinking about other spaces that maybe have like they have the like they are still building the infrastructure, so better to build it in a better way rather than like continuing to copying things that are flawed from a business perspective or a exploitation perspective from the beginning. So that to me was also very cool to see that just innovation comes from not the global
it
north
can
but also
come
the
from,
global south.
yeah. Yeah, I think the location is incidental, right? I think the protocol is abstract in so many. It's the universal protocol. So it might have as well been that the Genesis authors, you've spoken to Ravi, they could have been located anywhere. It happened to be India. So it's like HTTP. So nobody asks, was HTTP invented in the US or where else, right? So that is another aspect which, we were really excited when we heard you talk about it initially. So thanks for that, Andres. Mike, what was your reaction to looking at Beckn protocol as a way of building out these set of platforms on an open network?
Yeah, I think again, it was just very obvious to me that the nature of these food delivery networks should be run at a local level. There's nothing about my experience that suggests that I would be the best person to run a food delivery service in a market where I don't know anyone. I don't know any of the restaurants. I don't know any of the drivers, but there are people that are very well connected in these local networks. Maybe even to back up a little bit more, when I first met my co-founder Gladeson, he was starting a different food delivery service in Iowa City. And I was starting a centralized food delivery service in Miami. And I was spending a tremendous amount of time building this beautiful piece of software that I thought was like elegant and people would enjoy using. And then I was trying to sell it to restaurants, and the restaurants were like, get out of my store. I don't want to hear from you. Stop selling me things, like you're just another technology provider. And my now co-founder Gladeson sent me a download link to the app store of the app that they were using in Iowa City. And it was the clunkiest, slowest, low latency, ugly piece of software I've ever used in my entire life. And then he sent me the books for the company. And I looked at it and I said, this person is either a liar or he knows something that I am currently unaware of. And he started telling me about how they got all the restaurants together in Iowa to start this cooperative user-owned alternative because the restaurants don't like working with these third parties. They charge outrageous fees. The drivers sometimes steal the food, and they built this local alternative. And to me, it just struck me as immediately obvious that the power of user-owned networks was the inevitable future of food delivery. There's no reason that this one-size-fits-all solution from DoorDash, Uber Eats, or those are the US platforms, was going to be the winning solution for every market and all users' needs across because these markets are very different. Food delivery in New York is very different than food delivery in rural Louisiana, for example. And so these markets should justify their own solutions, right? And so to me, the thought experiment has always been, what if you could provide user experience parity with these bigger platforms, but allow each market to adapt to the unique requirements of the local context? And that would ultimately be like the inevitable winning solution. So over the last couple of years, and Beckn is really an option for how to ultimately realize that goal. I think one of the biggest things to me that is a huge unlock is that in the world of the last 2 decades of network-based products and marketplaces in Silicon Valley, it's really this one-size-fits-all solution universally applied to a category of industry. And there's many things that could be delivered that are not being delivered. And there's many ways that a restaurant could interface with their customer that it's currently not, because these big companies haven't dreamt it up yet. And so I view decentralized networks as a mechanism to unlock microeconomies. And the sum of all the microeconomies will ultimately be much larger than the one idea that some centralized platform is trying to deliver to the world. So I think that this actually, not only is it exciting on an ethical level, but it's also a huge opportunity for a next generation of internet products. I think maybe even a consumer software revolution. So yeah, it's very, very, very exciting.
Yeah, and I think as Mike mentioned, like we've been inspired, but also in some ways, not concerned, but like thinking about the challenges of decentralization in other environments. So Mike mentioned decentralized social media as an example, and that's something that we've been looking at and experimenting with. So some of you may have heard of, when people try to leave Twitter, they found alternatives that are decentralized, like Mastodon or Blue Sky and others, and they're all like protocols, not platforms and so on. So they have the same ethos and so on. But I think what makes food delivery, in my eyes, a more well-aligned kind of business with decentralization versus social media is that in social media you want to connect, or you don't care essentially whether you connect with your neighbor or not on Twitter, that you connect with the whole world. But in the case of local commerce like food delivery, the kind of federation and decentralization is kind of built in already in the business. So you do care about getting food from a restaurant that is nearby, because you cannot get, if I live in London, I cannot get food from a restaurant in New York. I really care about their London restaurants, right? Versus in social media, you may actually want to connect to people in New York and London and, Bangalore, wherever they are. And so the decentralization is, in social media at least, is obviously has a lot of advantages, because there's a lot of issues with centralized networks, but from a user perspective, there's not as much immediate value. But in the case of food delivery, transportation, and other things that are already kind of tied to location, it makes a lot of sense to think about decentralization and federated models and these sort of things. And so for that reason, I feel like efforts like Beckn are well aligned with commerce in ways that other environments may not be as potentially successful.
I think that you really captured the essence of it, Andres and Mike. In fact, when Mike was talking, it was like listening to sometimes Dr. Pramod and Sujit talking about the whole ethos of why the open network approach, or why a decentralized model, and why that will work. You spoke about microeconomies coming together and becoming bigger than a mega economy, and a localized approach will unlock much more, lead to exponential say growth. And That was perfect. And I think again you hit the nail on the head when you said these sectors at least are inherently already localized. So there is no reason not to go after a decentralized approach. And if a protocol that another way to look at it is also probably food delivery is one, but if you're extending it to other services, you don't have to look at another kind of protocol or technology, or the same protocol extends itself to other products, other services. So is that something you're looking at as well in terms of, because delivery is delivery, food delivery is one kind of delivery. In India, we have an operator called Dunzo who does food delivery, grocery delivery. It's like a courier for everything. Tell me what you want delivered from an individual or from a business to wherever you want, and I'll do it. So is that something that's part of the vision of the OpenDeli project, or what is the roadmap?
Yeah. I mean, I started mentioning that in our lab we're interested in kind of the future of work in general, and
Mhm,
so food delivery is one of the specific verticals that we're very excited to work on.
mhm,
I think broadly speaking, from my perspective, a lot of these marketplaces that are like essentially labor marketplaces, I think of it as, food delivery is one example where the courier part is a labor marketplace, like you need a task being perform in a particular location, or transportation is another example of a labor marketplace, or
mhm.
even things like, at least in the US, there is a system called TaskRabbit that you can ask people to come to your
Yeah.
house and perform a task specifically. There's a lot of even like, nurses and home care, and there's lots of different things that are about performing work in a particular location that are
Mhm,
increasingly gigified, and that are kind of typically built through centralized platforms that extract a transaction fee. And so all
mhm,
of that to me, is part of what I could imagine a future where those marketplaces and those platforms could be either community owned, and meaning owned maybe by the groups of workers that are in the platform, or maybe even like publicly funded, like in some municipalities they may be interested in funding this. I know there's been some experiments in California, and I feel like somewhere else in the US, where the mayor's office essentially funds or tries to fund the marketplace for aggregating labor essentially. So I think to me, in kind of the big vision for this space is really to think about creating the tools that enable people to connect with each other and kind of provide services and exchange money for those services, and to over time rely less and less on platforms that take oversized transaction fee. Obviously, there is a need for taking a transaction fee for maintaining the system, but
right.
those could be coming through taxes or even through transaction fees, obviously, that just support for the building and operation of the systems. But some of the analysis that we've done in the US at least, Uber takes up to 70% of the transaction fee for transportation, which is huge. And all of that goes to the platform, and the 30% goes to the driver, and some of that they have to pay in gas. So it makes it very hard. So I imagine that there are ways that we can go below 70% and still make it
Absolutely.
sustainable. Yeah.
Yeah, in India, it's the other way, 30% commission fee for the drivers. And that's why Namaya 3 that you mentioned works really well. The drivers get to keep all of the 100%. Mike, when it comes to restaurants per se, just coming back again to the restaurant delivery business, what has been the kind of uptake of this model, the kind of model Nosh has, cooperative based on open source and open network model? Uh, how are the restaurants adapting to it? UX, I mean, the usability and the user interface is one aspect, but uh, just taking the point on commissions and all of that, are they seeing a benefit on that front? Some insights on that front.
Yeah, so Nosh charges highly reasonable fees, about a third of the average commission for an independent restaurant on the incumbent services. So in third-party marketplaces, so you were actually laying the framework for the current food delivery industry at the beginning of this conversation.
Right.
And you mentioned that it might make sense for someone like Starbucks who can justify the commissions, but it's even more,
Right.
it's actually more cynical than you framed it, because these big platforms, DoorDash, Uber Eats, they have sweetheart contracts with the likes of McDonald's and Subway and Starbucks and Chipotle, that are funded by higher commissions by the independent restaurants who have less negotiating power because they have less like what I would call gravity in terms of pulling in a customer base. So these independent restaurants have this very they almost view these third-party delivery services as a necessary evil and kind of like a parasite to their business. Like, man, I wish I didn't have to be on these platforms, but I'm a small restaurant, and this is an industry that is perfectly competitive. People have options, and if I'm not on these platforms, I'm losing out on that customer base. And so we approach the restaurants and say, you will, by participating in Nosh, you will earn rights to future dividends on Nosh relative to your contributions, and we'll charge you a third of the average commission. And what the restaurants then do is do with us is what is otherwise expensive for the incumbent services to do. So my argument would be that it is more economically rational to build a user-owned network. We last year were more profitable than DoorDash, which is kind of a funny, which we didn't make it. It's a sleight of hand a little bit what I just said, because DoorDash is famously just losing a couple $100 billion a year. But the restaurants do the advertising. So most of DoorDash is a huge portion, up to 30% of DoorDash's net revenues each year are spent on marketing and acquisition of supply. Our restaurants work with us to acquire more restaurants, and then they publish like Nosh signage and 4-foot by 4-foot signs in the windows of their restaurants, and slowly we convert users to using Nosh. And if you're doing about 300 orders a day as a restaurant, and we transition your orders from Uber Eats or DoorDash to Nosh, we'll save you north of $150,000 a year. And in exchange for that, with this cooperative model, the restaurants do what is otherwise expensive for the centralized service to do. And so it's this win-win solution that only works if this is a local thing where you actually get empower the participants like this. So I don't know if I answered your question. Maybe I want to.
No, you absolutely did. And just digging a little further there. So do restaurants do both? I mean, they are on the big gig platforms as well as on Nosh, or because of the challenges of being with the big platforms, they stick to Nosh. Then where I'm going with this question is, so do consumers, I like my local restaurant. I get my certain kind of burger only in my small independent restaurant. It's not a restaurant chain. I don't want a Burger King, a burger from a Burger King. So is that kind of a pull or draw for consumers as well? So they know that if I go to Nosh, I'll get an exclusive range of restaurants. I'll find some hidden gems that I might not, because every Uber Eats or DoorDash is going to have the same set of restaurants, right? I mean, the chains and restaurants. So is that kind of a cascading pull? And if you could comment a bit on that.
Yeah, so this has been sort of our user acquisition strategy in the early days. I would say that it's becoming more difficult as time goes on, especially because we operate in a university town where there's a new set of students that comes in with the established delivery service applications already installed on their apps. So that makes things a bit more challenging, but we have about 40% of the restaurants in the regions in which we operate, which is Northern Colorado, Fort Collins, Windsor, Loveland, and Greeley. 40% of the restaurants are exclusive on Nosh. So they do not use the other services. So if you want to get your favorite food, there's only one place to go. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah.
But I would say that this is, it's becoming more increasingly difficult to retain that sort of exclusivity from the merchants without having like this advanced set of perpetual features that users find valuable, like Dash Pass and some of those other things. But yeah. I won't
I
slip
do feel
into
like there's
talking about the problems.
an inflection point right now with regards to any of these platforms because as Mike was saying, many of them are still not profitable. Many of them are now publicly traded, which means that there is a lot more expectations for them to be profitable, and they're no longer receiving, unlimited venture capital money. So I think in that sense, there is a lot more pressure on them to be profitable, which probably will mean, and it's already happening in many places, that they're going to be increasing their prices more and more. So that's kind of something that is putting pressure there. The other part is on the policy side. There's a lot of local governments that are trying to pass laws that say make sure that drivers get compensated fairly, which also increases prices of these companies. Or sometimes they ask them to release data to understand the impact on the environment or on like accidents. I think in New York City there was some interest around doing that. And so I think there's a lot of pressure coming from many different sides. So that gives me hope that organizations like Nosh can succeed in this space because the traditional companies are increasing their prices and also getting more pressure from the government. And I think the providing alternatives at this moment seems really key for saying, okay, maybe there is problems with these ones, but the idea is not like to go back to where we were before, where we were making phone calls and stuff like that, but instead here is an alternative. And so, I do think that this is a good time to be exploring this, even though there's a lot of difficulties. One of the things that I learned from Mike and folks at Nosh is like how much infrastructure and software layers there are in every transaction. So like when you push a button and you order a piece of pizza, there's like so many different companies that are taking a piece of that dollar that you pay from Google to provide mapping. There's a
Yeah.
few cents that go to the mapping API, to the credit cards, to the company like Stripe to distribute the money to different stakeholders, to like the point of sale tablet software that somebody pays for, and so all these different pieces that are taking a piece of the puzzle. And so it just feels like there's a lot of extraction going on, and in an environment that is already very thin margins. And so it's a very challenging space for that reason as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
if I may,
Sure.
I think there just to like hammer that point, there might be more middlemen in a restaurant food delivery order than any other industry in the world. I don't know the details and intricacies of every other industry, but just for a small food transaction, there's up to five or six middlemen to process that payment and get the food to the customer, which is kind of outrageous. And if you think about the nature of the transaction, which this is very like a Beckn-like narrative, it's like there's really all there is a driver willing and capable to perform a service, a restaurant willing and capable to broadcast their catalog to a network, and a buyer with an intent to purchase those two services. And there is absolutely no need for all of those middle layers. And so I think if anybody here is like interested in Beckn type products, something that would be very interesting is a Beckn compatible point of sale system, because then you could just go straight to the buyer side application layer from the point of sale that broadcasted the catalog, and we could cut out like 4 middlemen in this transaction, save money for the customer, save money for the restaurant and the driver. So that'd be an interesting thing, that conversation worth having.
Yeah,
possibly.
maybe to add to that, Mike, like it's not just the point of sale, but also there are aggregators, because there's so many different point of sale software that now there are companies that charge restaurants for a layer on top of all the different like delivery services, so that they all go through that into their point of sale. And so that is yet another layer that people have to pay for, and which is kind of crazy to think about how many layers there may be in this business.
Yeah, I think one of those companies that has outside of the US that's very popular is a company called DeliverRect, and they're really a $1 billion point of sale aggregation tool. How is that possible that something like that exists, right?
I think, and the whole aggregator model is what in an open network based approach is addressing. Kind of unbundle everything, disaggregate, and then kind of unify. You hit the nail on the head again now, Mike. So that's exactly what Uber and all of the players are doing. Delivery Rat, player that you mentioned, the billion-dollar player, and removing the middlemen, allowing, like you put it, that's exactly the Beckn narrative. There are people who are providing products and services. There are a set of consumers who want those products and services, allowing them to discover each other without all the layers of aggregation and middlemen, like you called it, is exactly what an open network based on a protocol like Beckn does. So I think I just have a last question before I think I just noticed that it's a very interesting conversation. I didn't even realize we are nearly at the top of the hour. What is the current state of the OpenDeli project? I know Nosh is on it. Where is the whole project at currently? And are there plans for getting other, you mentioned there are hundreds of players like Nosh in the US itself. So a little bit about what is where's the project at, and what are the plans ahead?
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell you. So earlier I mentioned that there's like three different stakeholders in this space:
Right.
the restaurant, the couriers, and the customers. And so the OpenDeli effort that our group has been focusing on is primarily only focused on the courier side.
Okay.
So we have a prototype version of the mobile application for the couriers and the backend infrastructure that connects that. And that backend infrastructure, one of the things that we're planning to add is to add support for backend so that the restaurant infrastructure can connect to it using something like backend in addition to other protocols or systems. But that's the two pieces of the OpenDeli part. And then Mike and folks at Nosh have been building the other parts, the kind of the restaurant component, which is pretty complex, all the catalogs and stuff like that, and the customer experience for the person ordering the food, which also, as we talked about, like has to be kind of modern and people expect things like Uber and other things, so it has to be of that quality. So this is kind of like the multiple different components, and Mike can say more about the pieces that they've been working on.
Yeah, we're currently testing brand new infrastructure for mobile and web applications for restaurants and customers. And that's been going very well. And then our plan is to make that software available. And we're working with now 7 and more every week. We're just putting feelers out to different local delivery networks across the US who might be interested in joining us and using our software. And the response to that has been like 100% interest. We touched a few times on the current state of affairs. I mentioned the story of like the software that my co-founder sent me was very ugly. So a lot of people are still using that software and they wish they didn't have to. So we're planning to offer ours to those local markets. So I think that there's a relatively clear path. Andres mentioned that there's like hundreds of local delivery services. The total, all these local delivery services in the US make up a little bit more than $500 million in sales annually, which is still a very small percentage of the $350 billion market. But we think that that's sort of our entry point to unlocking this next generation of networks. And we're working with a handful of them already. So I would say in the next couple of years, we'll have these products rolled out to 10, 20, 50 markets across the US. So
perfect. I think on that note, we will segue to questions from the audience. Otherwise, we will not have time to take some of those up. But thank you, Andres and Mike. I think it gave us a really good insight into how you're approaching the food delivery sector, why an open decentralized approach, how Beckn is enabling a lot of this, and the 3 areas, right? The consumer side, the restaurant side, the courier side. It is a complex business, I think. Already there are 3 players, even in a decentralized model. So how having this approach is enabling a more fair and equitable opportunity for the smaller players in the industry, as well as providing choice for consumers. A couple of questions have come in. I'm going to, in the interest of time, pick a few. One question, and either of you can take it up, is how does open network model with Beckn protocol ensure fairness and transparency in the food delivery ecosystem? I think we did cover that in the conversation, but the question extends to also how does it address data privacy and security for both the restaurants and consumers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still learning about backend every day, but my understanding is that there are certain kinds of transparency needs that may need to be addressed in some ways outside the protocol. So to give you an example,
Exactly.
one of my students has been working on understanding the take rate of the platforms like Uber and others, and it's been very hard to get data to do that. And so what we've been doing is we've been crowdsourcing the data by installing a separate app on drivers' phones, and then tracking the activity and seeing how much they got paid versus how much the consumer got charged. And so I think that's the kind of transparency it needs, that some cities in the US, like Chicago and others, have forced companies to release data where they have like the specifics of the ride and then the amount of money that they charge, and how much they gave to the driver. And so that kind of data, it seems like outside of the scope of the backend protocol, but it's the kind of data that governments and labor organizations and other people need and want. So maybe this is an opportunity to expand backend to enable this sort of data sharing. But the privacy question is a key one, right? Because
Yeah.
if you're releasing this data, how do you make sure that you're not releasing very sensitive PII? And so specifically in the case of Chicago, one of the things that they did is that they are using a kind of obfuscated location for beginning and end of a ride. So they give you the center of a polygon that is in the region where the user was picked up from. And so it's not exactly the latitude and longitude from where they come from. It's more like a region. And so
Area.
that's one way they were able. But with any of these things, there's no perfect, data release that cannot be reverse engineered, or like at least figuring out some information, especially if the regions are very sparsely populated. You can actually figure things out more easily than in a densely populated area. So that's an ongoing kind of conversation. Maybe this is the kind of data that is only available for policymakers and not for everyone. Maybe individual drivers could have access to their own data and share it in an anonymized way or de-anonymized way to a repository. So there's a lot of kind of details there that need to be addressed. But I do think that this is something that a lot of people are asking for.
And just to add to that, similar questions come. We've done a small project in Amsterdam. We had Jeff earlier in the call from Atomical, based out of Netherlands. We've done a very similar project there, exploring hyperlocal delivery and hyperlocal commerce for a small region in Amsterdam, where the aim was to empower local entrepreneurs, the retail entrepreneurs, and the local bike couriers. So bikes and two-wheelers are a big thing because we spoke about the cyclops. So the idea was to promote both local entrepreneurship as well as sustainability. Order from within your local area, then there's less travel, less pollution, all of that, less energy consumed. And being in Europe, I mean, the very first question was all about GDPR and privacy and security. And the point here is actually it's not the protocol. The protocol is not transporting data or transmitting data. The Beckn protocol is agnostic to all of it. It doesn't see anything. It does not see the transaction and the data pass through the network. It is for the platforms on both ends implementing the protocol and the terms and conditions that they deploy. That is one aspect. The other is there are layers that you can build on top of the base infrastructure that Beckn provides. And we're doing that in what we call the Open Network for Digital Commerce in India, which is on a same approach, but for the online commerce business. So why shop only at the Amazons of the world? Say apply the same open decentralized approach in online commerce. And they have built layers on top of the base protocol, which is for consent-based data sharing, for example. How can that be enabled? Ensuring security, privacy, having control over what gets shared. Like you mentioned, a restaurant can decide it wants to share certain kind of data. Consumers can decide what kind of data they want to share, and it is all consent based. I just wanted to throw that in, that it is possible, but it is not about the protocol per se, but it's about how the platforms choose to implement it.
Yeah.
Uh,
By the way, I just saw that Mike needs to go to another call in case you haven't seen it.
you have
Yep.
you have another, okay.
I do have to jump, but this was fun, and I feel like we are missing. We have more to discuss, so it would be great to follow up after this call. I think there's like we just opened a whole nother conversation on privacy and encryption, and I know that there's a lot of like IPFS related encryption protocols out there that allow for selective disclosures, as well as like verifiable credentials coming online in the European Union. So there's a lot of interesting things that we could talk about. So yeah, maybe just a last note. It would be great to like start conversations with the rest of the community. And if anybody's interested in food delivery, decentralized food delivery, I left my email in the chat, and we can feel free to share that with the rest of the group. So thank you for the invitation. It was great to be here.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much. And I think it was like you said, we are not done. I think we need a part 2. We will definitely have another Beckn Beyond, when there is a little more that we can talk about, as well as unpack a lot about the security and privacy aspect. Any last thoughts or pointers from you, Andres, before we wrap up?
No, just to echo what Mike says, feel free to reach out, and happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, audience. Yes, you will have the recording of the session. It will be put up on YouTube in a day or two after some cleanup and processing. So thank you. Thank you, everybody.